Chapter 1. The Beginnings of Art, Cave Paintings and Early Symbols. The history of art begins long before there were states, cities, or even written traditions. Art is older than most cultural achievements. It has accompanied man since his earliest beginnings. As early as the Paleolithic age, tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors left traces of their thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, in the form of cave paintings, engravings, and small sculptures. These early works are not just random scribbles, but an expression of a worldview that placed humans in a context with nature, animals, community, and the supernatural. The most famous testimonies of this era can be found in caves such as Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain. There, hidden deep in the rock faces, masterful representations of animals were discovered: bison, horses, deer, wild boar. With astonishing precision and liveliness, the artists brought their motifs to the wall. They used earth pigments such as ochre and charcoal, sometimes mixing them with animal fat to create durable colors. The lines showed that they were not clumsy beginners, but people with a pronounced aesthetic sense. Why did our ancestors create these images? There are still various theories about this today. Some researchers see them as a kind of magical ritual. By painting the animals, they hope to be successful in the hunt, or they believe that they could banish their life force into the cave walls. Others interpret the paintings as an expression of early mythical religious thinking that was intended to represent the relationship between humans, animals, and nature. Still others emphasize the social dimension. Perhaps these images were part of communal festivals that strengthened the cohesion of a group. In addition to the paintings, sculptural works of art were also created. The so-called Venus figures are famous, small sculptures made of stone, ivory, or clay, which usually depict voluptuous female bodies. The most famous is the Venus of Willendorf, which originated in Austria over 25,000 years ago. Their round shapes suggest an emphasis on fertility, motherhood, and life. Whether they served as religious objects, amulets, or symbols of fertility remains unclear. But they show that humans began early on to idealize the body and symbolically exaggerate it. Engravings on bones, stones, and tools also testify to the creative power of this time. Lines, patterns, and signs show that art was not only a depiction of the visible world, but also a means of abstraction, of the representation of ideas and rhythms. Some of these patterns may have been early forms of symbolic communication, perhaps even a precursor to writing. The art of the early period thus had many functions. It was magic, religion, decoration, memory, and communication at the same time. It made the invisible visible and connected people with forces that they could not explain. She transformed the darkness of the caves into spaces full of meaning and mystery. Another fascinating element is the spatial staging of the paintings. Many pictures are not located at the entrances, but deep inside the caves, in hard-to-reach places. This suggests that art was not intended for the everyday gaze, but was part of special, perhaps sacred actions. The cave thus became a kind of place of worship, a sacred space in which man and the supernatural. The beginnings of art show us that creativity and aesthetic sensibility are part of the essence of human beings. Long before agriculture, cities, or writing existed, people shaped their world with images, shapes, and symbols. Art was a means of interpreting reality, creating community, and going beyond the visible. In this early phase, man laid the foundation for something that accompanies him to this day: the urge to express himself through shapes and colors, to tell stories, and to make the unspeakable visible. The cave paintings and Venus figures are therefore not only archaeological finds, but testimonies to the deepest human longing for meaning and beauty. Chapter 2. Art in Ancient Egypt, Symbols of Power and Religion. When we look at the art of ancient Egypt, we enter a world where images and shapes were far more than mere jewelry. They were an expression of a deep-rooted worldview in which religion, politics, and society were inextricably linked. Egyptian art was not art for its own sake, but always purposeful. It served the belief in the gods, the glorification of the pharaohs, and the securing of eternal life. The monumental pyramids of Giza, which were built over 4,500 years ago, already bear witness to this attitude. They were not simply tombs, but powerful symbols of divine order. The pyramids were intended as steps into eternity, as a bridge between the realm of men and the world of the gods. Their precise alignment with the cardinal directions and constellations makes it clear that they had cosmic significance. The art of architecture became the embodiment of a worldview in which the pharaoh, as the son of the sun, was at the center. This symbolism continued in the temples. Wall reliefs and sculptures showed the world of gods in strictly ordered forms. The depictions followed clear rules. People were depicted in the so-called frontality, head and legs in profile, upper body and eyes frontally. This system had nothing to do with a lack of powers of observation, but was the expression of a concept. It was intended to make the essential characteristics of a person or god visible at the same time. In Egypt, art did not mean the imitation of reality, but the representation of the essential, the eternal. Hieroglyphics, that fascinating mixture of pictorial and phonetic transcription, were also more than signs for writing. They themselves were works of art, often brightly painted and carefully carved in stone. In ancient Egypt, writing was closely linked to religion. It was believed that the written word gave something endurance and power. Thus, the art of writing became a sacred act. The burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings are particularly impressive. The walls of these rooms are covered with scenes from the Book of the Dead, mythological representations, and ritual images. They were supposed to show the deceased the way to the afterlife, offer protection, and secure the connection to the gods. The famous death mask of Tutankhamun, made of gold and precious stones, was also more than a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It was intended to make the king immortal in the afterlife by preserving his divine face. The sculptures of ancient Egypt, from monumental colossal statues to filigree statuettes, also followed clear rules. The pharaoh was portrayed in an idealized way, young, strong, with a stern expression that emphasized his divine dignity. Even when he died in old age, he was shown as a timeless ruler. The art did not serve to resemble individual portraits, but to illustrate his role as a mediator between humans and gods. In addition to this official art, there were also everyday objects that were artistically decorated: jewelry, amulets, furniture, and vessels. They testified to the fact that beauty and symbolism were not only reserved for temples and tombs, but also found their way into daily life, albeit especially in the circles of the upper class. A central principle of Egyptian art was continuity. For thousands of years, the style remained largely unchanged. While in Greece or Europe the urge for innovation later prevailed, in Egypt the will to preserve prevailed. Change would have meant questioning the order of the world. This consistency gives Egyptian art its unmistakable clarity and timeless charisma. And yet there were also moments of rupture. In particular, the era of the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BC brought a short phase of radical renewal. He introduced the cult of the sun god Aton and changed the art. Figures were suddenly depicted more naturally, with softer shapes, and sometimes even with realistic features. After his death, however, people quickly returned to the old traditions, proof of how strongly Egyptian culture adhered to continuity and order. The art of ancient Egypt shows us that art can be more than aesthetic play. She was the bearer of a worldview, an expression of religion and power, a means of overcoming death. To this day, the pyramids, statues, and murals fascinate us not only because of their beauty, but also because of the idea they embody: the search for eternity and divine order. Chapter 3: Mesopotamian Art, Ziggurats, Reliefs, and Early Writings. While a highly developed culture emerged along the Nile in Egypt, another cradle of civilization was formed in Mesopotamia, between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Between the Euphrates and the Tigris. It was here that some of the world's earliest city-states developed, while also producing a rich artistic tradition. The art of Mesopotamia is closely linked to religion, power, and the invention of writing. At first glance, it seems stricter and more sober than the Egyptian one, but on closer inspection, it unfolds in equally great expressiveness. A central architectural element of Mesopotamia was the ziggurat, a monumental stepped tower made of mud bricks. Unlike the pyramids in Egypt, which were tombs for pharaohs, ziggurats were temple mounts dedicated to the gods. They rose above the cities and dominated the cityscape. At its top was a shrine where the deity of the city was worshipped. The ziggurats symbolized the connection between heaven and earth, between gods and men. The most famous of these buildings is the ziggurat of Ur, which was dedicated to the moon god Nana. Mesopotamian art was strongly influenced by religion. Reliefs and sculptures depicted gods, kings, and mythical scenes. Particularly impressive are the stone reliefs of the Assyrians, who decorated palaces with long sequences of images. They showed war scenes, hunts, or ceremonies. The focus was less on individual portraits and more on the depiction of power and domination. The king was portrayed as an invincible warrior or a ruler blessed by the gods. A well-known example are the reliefs from the palace of Assur-Nasirpal II in Nimrud, which depict lion hunts. These images are not only marked by technical mastery, but also of symbolic significance. The king defeats the lion, the most dangerous animal on the steppe, proving his ability to bring order to chaos, a metaphor for his rule. The sculptures of Mesopotamia also had a strong religious character. In particular, the so-called votive statues from the temples of Tel Asmar show believers in a praying posture with wide open eyes. These eyes were considered a symbol of vigilance and incessant devotion to the gods. The statues were placed in the temple to pray permanently on behalf of the people, an indication of how closely art was linked to religious life. Another decisive contribution of Mesopotamia to art history was the invention of writing. With cuneiform, which emerged from the 4th millennium BC, mankind began to hold on to language permanently. Initially, the signs were mainly used for administrative purposes, such as recording goods and taxes. But writing soon developed into a medium of culture. Epics such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest poems in the world, were recorded in cuneiform. The clay tablets on which the signs were carved are not only carriers of text, but also works of art themselves. However, the art of Mesopotamia was not limited to temples and palaces. Everyday objects such as seals, jewelry, or ceramics were also artistically designed. The cylinder seals are particularly remarkable. Tiny cylinders decorated with finely crafted scenes. When rolled over damp clay, they left behind a relief image that often showed scenes of gods, animals, or ritual acts. These seals were not only practical for marking documents or goods, but also small masterpieces of miniature art. Compared to Egypt, the art of Mesopotamia may have seemed less monumental in its permanence. Mud bricks decay faster than stone. But its expressive power is no less. While Egypt aimed at eternity with strict symbolism, Mesopotamia shows an art that emphasized life in its dynamics and power in its staging. Mesopotamian art is therefore not only a mirror of religion, but also of political life. Kings had their victories immortalized in reliefs to demonstrate their power. Temples were decorated with images that kept the gods present. Writing became a medium of administration, but also of culture. Everything served to create order towards the gods, towards people, and against unpredictable nature. In this way, the art of Mesopotamia shows how art and civilization are intertwined. Where cities are created, where writing is developed, there is also an art that not only decorates, but also organizes, symbolizes, and legitimizes. It is thus a fundamental chapter in the long history of human creativity. Chapter 4. The art of Greek antiquity, harmony and ideal. With Greek antiquity, art history entered an epoch that has remained formative to this day. Greece not only developed a variety of new forms of artistic expression, but also a philosophy of art that set standards for centuries. Beauty, harmony, and the pursuit of the ideal determined Greek art. But at the same time, it reflected the political, religious, and social life of the polis. The architecture of the Greeks was closely linked to religion. Temples formed the center of the cities, built in honor of the gods. The most famous example is the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens, dedicated to the goddess Athena. The building is characterized by an extraordinary harmony of proportions. The orders of columns, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, became typical features of Greek architecture. These orders were more than mere building forms. They embodied order, measure, and beauty, values that were at the heart of the Greek world. In addition to the temples, other buildings were also built. Theaters, whose semicircular shape perfectly amplified the sound of the voice, or stadiums, which were places of communal games. Here, architecture was not just a technical work, but an expression of political and social life, a mirror of the polis, the community of citizens. Sculpture experienced a flourishing in Greece that was second to none. While the early archaic Kouroi statues still appeared stiff and frontal, in the 5th century BC, people began to depict the human body in a more natural and dynamic way. The figure of Myron's discobolo is famous, an athlete at the moment before he hurls the discus. The tension of the body, the momentum of the movement, all this shows the new realism combined with the ideal of the beautiful body. The goal of the sculptors was not mere imitation, but the representation of the ideal. Bodies were not shown in their individual imperfection, but in their perfect form. Beauty was considered an expression of the divine, and the representation of man became an approach to the divine itself. Works such as the Venus de Milo or the Apollo of Belvedere embody this search for the ideal measure. Another highlight of Greek art was the work of Phidias, who directed the sculptural work on the Parthenon. His sculptures, especially the monumental statue of Athena in the Parthenon and the statue of Zeus in Olympia, were considered marvels in antiquity. In his works, religious veneration was combined with artistic perfection. Painting also played a role in Greece, although less has survived. Frescoes and vase painting give us insights into themes and styles. Vase painting developed from black figure to red figure techniques, which allowed for greater delicacy and detail. Scenes from mythology, everyday life, or sporting competitions were depicted with masterful clarity. A special feature of Greek art is its close connection to philosophy. Philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle discussed the nature of beauty, mimesis, the imitation of nature, and the role of art in human life. Plato saw art as a reflection of the world of ideas. Aristotle emphasized the educational value of tragedy and theater. Art was not only craftsmanship, but also an object of thought and part of intellectual life. Religious festivals, theater performances, sports competitions, all this was permeated by art. Tragedies by Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus were performed in the theater of Athens, which not only told dramatic stories, but also dealt with philosophical questions. Here, too, art was combined with religion, politics, and philosophy. Greek art created a visual language that still has an effect today. Their ideals shaped Roman art, the Renaissance, and even modernity. Greek temples are still considered models of architecture. Greek sculptures still stand for beauty and harmony. The peculiarity of Greek art lies in the fact that it placed the individual at the center. For the first time in history, man was portrayed not only as part of a divine cosmos, but as an independent being whose body and mind are expressions of dignity and beauty. In doing so, the Greeks laid the foundation for an understanding of art that still shapes our ideas today. Chapter 5. Roman Art, Realism and Monumentality. With Roman art, a new dimension enters history. While the Greeks strove for the ideal, harmony, and beauty, the Romans were primarily concerned with pragmatism, the development of power, and monumentality. Their art was intended to represent the empire, to make visible its order, its strength, and its expansion. The Romans took over much from the Greeks, but developed it further in their own unmistakable way. The architecture is arguably Rome's most impressive legacy. With technical innovations such as the arch, the vault, and the use of concrete, the Romans created buildings that still stand today. The Colosseum in Rome, opened in 80 AD, is probably the most famous example. It held over 50,000 spectators and served as an arena for gladiator fights, animal hunts, and public spectacles. Its architecture combined functionality with representative splendor, a symbol of Rome's power. The aqueducts, which bridged long distances and supplied cities with water, are also masterpieces of Roman architecture. They show that Roman architecture was not only aimed at representation, but also at practical usefulness. Bridges, roads, and thermal baths, all these were structures that were both functional and artistically designed. Another highlight is the Pantheon, a temple dedicated to all the gods. His domed building with the central opening, the oculus, was a technical marvel. The dome, still one of the largest made of unreinforced concrete, symbolized the sky, while the light through the oculus established the divine reference. The Pantheon combines engineering, religion, and aesthetics in a unique way. In sculpture, the Romans differed from the Greeks in their realism. While the Greeks depicted the idealized body, the Romans created portraits that emphasized individual features, wrinkles, scars, signs of age. These veristic portraits were not intended to express beauty, but character and dignity. In particular, the ancestral images of the Roman upper class show how important it was to make the tradition and merits of the ancestors visible. At the same time, the Romans adopted the Greek ideals, especially in the depiction of gods and heroes. Many Roman sculptures are copies of Greek originals, but they have often been placed in a new propagandistic context. A famous example is the statue of Emperor Augustus of Prima Porta, which shows him as a youthful ruler in the style of a Greek god, a trick that combined political power with divine legitimacy. Relief art played a particularly important role in Rome. Triumphal arches such as those of Titus or Constantine are decorated with reliefs depicting military victories. They were public monuments that showed the citizens the greatness of the empire and the power of the emperor. Trajan's Column in Rome, a 30-meter-high pillar, also tells the story of the Dacian War in over 200 scenes in a spiral relief, a gigantic picture book of Roman power carved in stone. The painting of Rome has been handed down mainly through the wall frescoes of Pompeii and Herculaneum. There you will find detailed depictions of landscapes, mythological scenes, and still lifes. Particularly fascinating is the illusionist painting, which played with perspectives and architectural elements so that walls seemed to be open-worked. These frescoes show that the Romans had a fine sense of color, spatial effect, and mood. Public life was also shaped by art. Triumphal processions, games, and processions were theatrical productions that combined art, architecture, and politics. In the thermal baths, the people's bathing establishments, mosaics adorned the floors and walls. Art was not only for the elite, but also part of everyday life, but always with the aim of underlying the greatness of Rome and the power of the emperor. At its core, Roman art was therefore a means of self-expression. It served to legitimize rule, glorify the empire, and make power visible. Its monumentality still impresses today, from the ruins of the forums to the remains of the thermal baths to the bridges and roads that crisscrossed Europe. While the Greeks were looking for the ideal, the Romans were making reality great. Their art was a mirror of power and a tool of politics. It combined engineering, pragmatism, and aesthetic design in a way that influenced the foundations of Western architecture and art into modern times. Chapter 6. Early Christian Art. Symbols of Faith. With the rise of Christianity, art changed fundamentally. While Roman art glorified power and domination, an art now developed that focused on faith. Early Christian art emerged in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, first in secret, later in the public eye, when Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. In the first centuries, Christians often lived underground. They were persecuted, their religion was banned, and their meetings were held in secret. It was during this period that the catacomb paintings were created, simple frescoes and symbols that adorned the walls of the underground tombs. Here we encounter the first Christian pictorial signs: the fish, ichthyes, the monogram of Christ, the Good Shepherd. These symbols were ambiguous. They could be understood by insiders, but often remained inconspicuous to outsiders. Here, art served the identity and comfort of the faithful, not public representation. With the turn of Constantine in the 4th century, everything changed. Emperor Constantine allowed Christianity, even promoted it, and had magnificent churches built. Art that had previously been hidden now became monumental. The architecture changed. Instead of temples, basilicas were built, large hall buildings that originally served as market halls or courtrooms. The famous Alt St. Peter's in Rome or the Lateran Basilica are early examples. These buildings provided space for meetings, processions, and liturgy, a new center of religious life. The furnishings of these churches reflected the new perspective. Mosaics covered the walls and apsices. They showed Christ as ruler, the apostles, and scenes from the Bible. Particularly characteristic is the depiction of Christ as a pantocrator, as a ruler of the world with a serious, lofty expression. These images were not mere illustrations, but part of faith. They conveyed the presence of the divine in the space of the church. At the same time, early Christian art adopted many elements from the Roman tradition. The sarcophagus of Junius Bassus from the 4th century, for example, shows scenes from the Old and New Testaments, depicted in a classical Roman relief style. This connection shows that the new religion initially resorted to familiar forms to express its message. An important aspect was the symbolic language. Since many believers were illiterate, the Bible was told in pictures: the shepherd carrying the lost sheep, Daniel in the lion's den, the 3 young men in the fiery furnace. These scenes made the faith vivid and helped to spread the doctrine. A clear order also developed in painting and iconography. Art was no longer oriented towards realism, but towards the transcendent. Figures appeared frontal, schematic, with large eyes and serious faces. Perspective and spatial depth were less important than symbolic meaning. Art should not imitate the visible world, but embody the invisible faith. Early Christian art thus stands at the transition between antiquity and the Middle Ages. It preserved much of the Roman tradition, but filled it with new meaning. Monuments of power became symbols of faith. Portraits became images of saints. Temples became churches. The idea that art is sacred was particularly formative. Images were not merely representations, but could make the divine itself present. This attitude was to be even more prominent in Byzantine art and in the veneration of icons. Early Christian art shows how art is in the service of a new worldview. It was an expression of the hope that death is not the end, but the beginning of eternal life. It was a comfort for the persecuted, a splendor for the faithful, and a means of reshaping an entire culture. Chapter 7. Byzantine Art, Mosaics, and Icons. With the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West and the continued existence of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, a new epoch of art began: Byzantine art. It developed from the early Christian tradition, but soon gained its own language, which was characterized by splendor, symbolism, and spiritual depth. While the Middle Ages with its Romanesque and Gothic forms grew up in Western Europe, Byzantine art remained a shining expression of the Christian faith in the East for centuries. The focus was on the church as a sacred space. The most famous building is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which was built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. Its gigantic dome seems to float weightlessly above the room, carried by invisible forces. Light that enters through the windows makes the room shine as if it were filled with divine presence. Architecture, technology, and symbolism merge here to form an expression of heaven on earth. The walls of Byzantine churches were decorated with mosaics, which are among the most impressive works of art in the world. Small pieces of stone and glass, often backed with gold, created images of luminous intensity. Scenes from the Bible, Christ as Pantocrator, the Blessed Mother Mary, angels and saints looked down on the faithful from the walls. These images were not only decorative, but spiritual. They were intended to make the heavenly world visible and transform the church into a sacred space. Particularly characteristic was the depiction of Christ as a Pantocrator, usually in the dome of the church. His earnest look, the blessing hand, the gospel book in the other hand, all this conveyed the message of his dominion over the world. The representation of the Mother of God also played a central role. As Theotokos, as the Mother of God, she became a symbol of Christ's incarnation and the epitome of care and mercy. A central element of Byzantine art were icons. These painted picture panels, usually with Christ, Mary, or saints, were not just pictures, but were considered windows to the divine. In the Orthodox tradition, an icon was not only representation, but participation. Whoever venerated an icon entered into a relationship with what was portrayed. Strict rules determined the way he painted: frontal, serious, without illusion of depth, but full of symbolic power. Colors, gestures, and attributes had fixed meanings. The veneration of icons led to a fierce controversy in the 8th and 9th centuries, the iconoclastic controversy. Parts of the Byzantine church rejected the icons as idols and had them destroyed. Others defended it as an indispensable form of expression of faith. The dispute finally ended with the recognition of icon veneration, which has remained central to the Orthodox Church to this day. Byzantine art was not limited to Constantinople. It spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, to Greece, the Balkans, and as far as Russia. In Ravenna, Italy, we find magnificent mosaics that reflect the splendor of this era. Later, Byzantine icons shaped Russian art, where they led to an independent tradition. Unlike the classical art of the Greeks and Romans, Byzantine art did not strive for realism, but for transcendence. She did not want to depict the visible world, but to make the invisible world tangible. Figures appeared frontally, without individual features, but with bright colors and golden backgrounds. Everything served to overcome the earthly and to make the divine tangible. Byzantine art remained surprisingly constant for centuries. While in Western Europe the style changed from Romanesque to Gothic, the East held on to its forms. This consistency was an expression of a deep conviction that art should not follow fashion or innovation, but should serve the eternal truth of faith. Today, Byzantine art fascinates with its luminous radiance and spiritual intensity. Mosaics and icons are not only historical testimonies, but also an expression of a world in which art and religion were inextricably linked. They show us how art wanted to bring heaven to earth, not through imitation, but through transfiguration. Chapter 8: Romanesque, Strict Forms and Religious Radiance. With the beginning of the Middle Ages in Western Europe and the rise of the Christian Church as a formative power, a new art style developed that reflected the spiritual attitude of the time, the Romanesque. From the 10th to the 12th century, it shaped architecture, sculpture, and painting. Their forms of expression are determined by simplicity, austerity, and at the same time by spiritual power. The Romanesque architecture is particularly recognizable in the large church buildings that shaped the landscape of Europe. Massive walls, thick pillars, small windows, and round arches characterize this style. The buildings appear solid, closed, and defensive, an architecture that was intended to radiate security in a time marked by uncertainties, wars, and religious longing. Many Romanesque churches are almost reminiscent of castles. They were not only places of worship, but also places of protection and community. Famous examples of Romanesque architecture are the Cathedral of Spire, the Abbey Church of Cluny in France, or the churches along the Way of St. James in Spain. These buildings were not only religious centers, but also stations for pilgrims on their way to Santiago de Compostela. The art of Romanesque is therefore closely linked to the pilgrimage movement. Churches were supposed to impress the faithful, welcome them, and strengthen their faith. A characteristic feature of Romanesque churches is the design of the portals. Above the entrance doors are large tympanum reliefs depicting scenes from the Bible, often the Last Judgment, Christ in the mandala surrounded by apostles and angels. These representations were the most important picture Bibles for many people who could not read. They were intended to show the faithful what awaited them, salvation or damnation. The Romanesque sculptures are of great expressive power. Figures are often strict, stylized, and integrated into the architecture. They are not free statues, but part of the building. Capitals, columns, and arches are decorated with scenes from the Bible or with fantastic creatures. Particularly impressive are the depictions of demons and scenes of hell, which warn the believers of the consequences of sin. Romanesque painting also followed clear rules. Frescoes adorned the interiors of the churches, especially in the apse and vaults. The pictures were two-dimensional, with strong colors and clear contours. Perspective and spatial depth did not play a role. The symbolism was important. Christ as judge of the world, angels, apostles, scenes from the Old and New Testaments, everything was ordered, frontal, and of serious dignity. A famous example of Romanesque painting are the frescoes of the Church of San Clemente in Rome, or the murals in Catalan churches such as San Clemente Taul. They show the power of this art, which did not work through illusion, but through radiance and symbolism. Romanesque is also closely linked to monastic culture. During this time, monasteries were centers of education, art, and spirituality. In their scriptoria, artistically illuminated manuscripts were created, whose miniatures depicted the biblical stories in bright colors. This book illumination is a highlight of Romanesque art in its own right, which captured knowledge and faith in pictures. The essence of Romanesque lies in its austerity and coherence. It does not want to show the beauty of the world, but the power of God. Everything is geared towards the afterlife. The architecture, the painting, the sculptures. In a world marked by uncertainties and dangers, Romanesque art offered people support and orientation. And yet, there is a great beauty in this austerity. The mighty walls, the clear shapes, the luminous frescoes, they create an atmosphere that still impresses today. Romanesque is less realistic than symbolic, less playful than sublime. It shows us an era in which art did not serve the individual, but the community and faith. Chapter 9. Gothic, Cathedrals and Light as a Divine Principle. The 12th century marked the beginning of a new era of art in Western Europe, which overcame the austerity and coherence of the Romanesque and strove for an unprecedented lightness and height, the Gothic. It was not only a new architectural style, but an expression of a changed world. Cities grew, trade and the bourgeoisie gained in importance, and the church looked for new forms of embodying faith. The result was buildings and works of art that are still considered symbols of the Middle Ages today. The heart of the Gothic period is the cathedral. With its sky-reaching towers, filigree flying buttresses, and huge windows, it was more than a building. It was a manifestation of faith. The famous French abbot Suger of St. Denis, one of the spiritual fathers of the Gothic style, saw in the light the symbol of the divine. His idea was to design churches in such a way that they were filled with colored light, a foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem. Architecturally, this was made possible by new techniques. The pointed arch and the ribbed vault made it possible to erect taller and lighter buildings. The flying buttresses carried the load of the walls outwards so that the walls no longer had to be massive, but could be broken through by windows. The result was a space that no longer seemed heavy and squat, but wide, flooded with light, and aspiring. Famous cathedrals such as Chartres, Amiens, Reims, or Cologne Cathedral embody this ideal. Its interior is filled with an atmosphere that is both overwhelming and sublime. The gaze is drawn upwards towards the vault, as if one were getting closer to heaven. A central element of Gothic art are the stained glass windows. Stained glass windows told biblical stories in bright colors. For the people of the Middle Ages, who often could not read, they were a picture Bible. At the same time, they transformed light itself into a medium of faith. When the sun shone through the glass windows, the divine seemed to enter the room. Sculpture also experienced a new heyday in the Gothic period. In contrast to the austere figures of the Romanesque period, Gothic sculptures appear more lively and individual. The figures on the portals of the cathedrals, for example in Chartres or Reims, show not only saints in sublime severity, but also people with human features, gestures, and feelings. Art opened up to life without losing its religious dimension. Gothic painting continued to develop in frescoes, book illumination, and panel painting. The illuminated manuscript in particular remained a highlight. Magnificent Bibles, books of hours, and liturgical texts were provided with filigree miniatures showing scenes from the Bible, but also plants, animals, and ornaments. Here, faithfulness was combined with artistic inventiveness. However, the Gothic was not only a style of the church, but also an expression of the city's culture. Cathedrals were the center of urban life. They were financed by guilds and citizens, and their construction could take centuries. They were symbols of a city's pride, an expression of wealth and piety at the same time. Another characteristic element of Gothic is the combination of art and didactics. Portals, stained glass windows, sculptures, and frescoes told stories, explained beliefs, and conveyed morals. Art was a teaching tool, a bridge between heaven and earth. The Gothic style continued to develop over centuries, from the early Gothic to the High Gothic to the Late Gothic. While the early cathedrals are characterized by clarity and harmony, the later buildings tend to be more and more complex and detailed. In the late Gothic period, highly ornamented facades, filigree towers, and abundant decorations were created, which almost exceeded the original austerity. The Gothic is still a symbol of medieval Europe today. Their cathedrals stand not only for architectural mastery, but for an entire worldview. The belief that the divine can be experienced in the light, that the community of people finds expression in monumental buildings, and that art can build a bridge to heaven. Chapter 10. The Art of the Renaissance, Rebirth of Antiquity. The Renaissance in the 15th century marked the beginning of one of the great upheavals in the history of art. The term Renaissance means rebirth, meaning the rediscovery of antiquity, the Greek and Roman ideals of beauty, harmony, and moderation. But the Renaissance was more than a return. It was a new heyday that laid the foundation of modern art and culture. The origins of the Renaissance lie in Italy, especially in cities such as Florence, Venice, and Rome. This is where economic wealth, political ambition, and intellectual curiosity came together. Powerful families such as the Medici promoted artists and scientists. Humanists took up the writings of antiquity, and a new image of man emerged. Man as the creator of his own world, as an individual with dignity and creative power. In architecture, people returned to the clear forms of antiquity. Columns, domes, and symmetry were taken up again, but with a new technical mastery. A masterpiece is the dome of the Florentine Cathedral, created by Filippo Brunelleschi. Using revolutionary techniques, he erected a construction that is still one of the greatest achievements of architecture today. Leon Battista Alberti also left his mark on architecture with works such as the facade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which embody clarity and harmony. Renaissance painting brought about a revolution. Artists discovered the central perspective, which enabled an illusionistic representation of space. Images gained depth, figures stood in realistic landscapes, and scenes seemed alive. Masaccio was one of the first to master this technique, for example in his fresco, The Trinity. Famous painters such as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo took art to a previously unattained height. Leonardo combined scientific observation with artistic sensitivity. His Mona Lisa fascinates with sistine mysterious expression, the play of light and shadow, the gentle modeling of the face. Michelangelo, on the other hand, created the Sistine Chapel, a monumental work that tells the biblical story of creation in powerful images. His figures are of dramatic power, full of movement and expression. Raphael, finally, embodied the harmony and grace of the Renaissance. His School of Athens in the Vatican shows philosophers and thinkers of antiquity in an ideal architecture, a symbol of the connection between knowledge, art, and faith. Sculpture also flourished. Donatello led the free stand back into the sculpture. His figure of David was the first freestanding nude statue since antiquity. Michelangelo later surpassed him with his monumental David, which became a symbol of the strength and dignity of man. Renaissance sculpture was no longer strictly bound, but free, physical, ideal, and at the same time individual. A special feature of the Renaissance was the new image of man. Man was no longer seen only as a sinner waiting for redemption, but as an individual who unfolds his dignity through knowledge, art, and creativity. Art was an expression of this new humanity. The body was celebrated, the beauty of nature was discovered, the joy of this world was emphasized. At the same time, religion remained a central issue. Many works were commissioned by the church: altars, frescoes, Madonna paintings. But even in the representation of the sacred, the human dimension emerges. Mary, Christ, the saints no longer appear enraptured, but human, approachable, marked by emotion and beauty. The Renaissance was also a time of exchange. Italy was the center, but soon the style spread across Europe, to Germany with artists such as Albrecht Dürer, to the Netherlands with painters such as Jan van Eyck, who created new possibilities with oil painting. Each brought their own accents, but the common striving for realism, harmony, and expression united them all. Renaissance art is still a highlight of human history today. It combines science and art, religion and humanism, tradition and innovation. It shows us a world in which man rediscovered himself as an individual, as a creator, as part of a divine order, and at the same time, as the master of his own culture. Chapter 11. Baroque: Drama, Splendor, and Staging of Power. With the transition to the 17th century, art changed fundamentally again. The harmony and clarity of the Renaissance was followed by the Baroque, an era full of movement, emotion, and splendor. The Baroque was created in a time of great tension: the Counter-Reformation, the political power struggles between princely houses, the 30 Years' War. Art became a means of proclaiming faith, staging power, and arousing emotions. Baroque architecture is characterized by dynamism and splendor. Churches, palaces, and squares were designed to overwhelm the senses. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is a masterpiece, the design of which was shaped by artists such as Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Its famous St. Peter's Square with its sweeping colonnades looks like an open embrace that welcomes the faithful. The architecture here becomes a spectacle, an expression of the triumph of the Catholic Church. Palaces such as Versailles in France are also typical Baroque works. Built under Louis XIV, the Sun King, Versailles was a symbol of absolutist power. The magnificent halls, the gardens with their axes and fountains, all this was intended to make the king's greatness visible. Architecture, art, and nature combined to create a staging that showed the ruler as the center of the universe. Baroque painting was characterized by light and movement. Artists such as Caravaggio used the strong light-dark contrast, the so-called chiaroscuro, to create dramatic effects. His paintings show saints and biblical scenes with unimagined directness. People with dirty feet, emotions full of pain and passion, the sacred in the middle of everyday life. In Spain, Diego Velázquez created a masterpiece of complexity with works such as Las Meninas, which involves the viewer himself in the pictorial events. In the Netherlands, the Baroque style produced its very own character. While religious themes dominated in Catholic countries, genre painting, still lifes, and landscapes developed here. Rembrandt created poignant portraits and biblical scenes full of depth, while Vermeer captured the quiet light of everyday life in scenes of unmatched delicacy. Baroque sculpture is imbued with movement and emotion. Bernini, the great sculptor of Rome, created works such as the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, a representation of mystical rapture that captures the moment between heaven and earth. Figures move, robes flutter, emotions are palpable. Nothing is static, everything is full of life and drama. A central concern of the Baroque was the staging of power and faith. After the Reformation, the Catholic Church wanted to renew its authority with art. The images were not only intended to instruct, but also to emotionally capture the faithful, to sweep them away, and to draw them into the spell of faith. The Baroque was therefore closely linked to the Counter-Reformation. At the same time, it was the art of absolutism. Princes and kings used architecture, painting, and sculpture to demonstrate their power. Versailles is only the most famous example. Palaces, opera houses, and squares were also built in Vienna, Madrid, and St. Petersburg that embodied the self-image of the rulers. The Baroque loved appearances and theatricality. Frescoes opened ceilings to the sky, illusion painting made rooms look larger than they were. Stage sets transformed theaters into worlds full of magic. Art and life blurred in a staging that was intended to arouse amazement. Despite all this splendor, the Baroque was not a uniform style. He had many faces: the dramatic, emotional Baroque of Italy, the magnificent court Baroque of France, the intimate bourgeois Baroque of the Netherlands. Everywhere, however, he was united by the search for intensity, for effect, for the splendor of the moment. The art of the Baroque is an art of passion. It wants to move, not just represent. It wants to overwhelm, not just explain. It reflects the tension of an epoch between faith and doubt, between power and transience, between splendor and abyss. Chapter 12. Rococo: Lightness, Elegance, and Decorative Exuberance. If the Baroque was the epoch of drama, the staging of power and overwhelming splendor, in the 18th century, the Rococo appeared, an art that transformed all this into the playful, light, and elegant. Rococo originated around 1720, initially in France, but soon spread over large parts of Europe. He was a child of courtly life, characterized by salons, pleasures, and the longing for grace. The term Rococo is derived from rocaille, shell work, a typical ornament of this time. This alone makes it clear that the Rococo was less monumental than the Baroque. It loved the small, delicate, and decorative. Instead of huge cathedrals or palaces, elegant castles, intimate rooms, and richly decorated interiors were built. Rococo architecture is particularly evident in castles and pleasure palaces. Instead of strictly symmetrical layouts as in Versailles, lighter, more playful forms were now preferred. Interiors were decorated with stucco, mirrors, and delicate pastel colors. The famous Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam, built for Frederick the Great, is a prime example, a cheerful retreat that served more leisure than a demonstration of power. In painting, the Rococo turned to the intimate, playful, and sensual. Artists such as Jean-Antoine Watteau painted scenes of gallant life, elegant parties in the garden, parties, music, and dance. His paintings show a world of pleasure, full of grace and subtle melancholy. François Boucher, another great Rococo painter, loved mythological scenes, which he depicted in sweet, colorful images. Venus, Cupid, and nymphs in idyllic landscapes. Jean-Honoré Fragonard is also one of the best-known representatives. His painting The Rocking Chair embodies the playful eroticism and lightness of this era. The Rococo sculpture was just as playful and elegant. Characters seemed delicate, moved, often depicted in cheerful scenes. Marble and porcelain were preferred, materials that allowed for fine details. Meissen porcelain in particular, with its filigree figures, is still a symbol of Rococo art today. Interior design and handicrafts also reached new heights. Furniture was elegantly curved. Chandeliers, mirrors, and vases were artfully decorated. Everything served to create an atmosphere of lightness and well-being. Unlike the Baroque, which wanted to overwhelm the viewer, the Rococo was intended to enchant. In terms of content, the Rococo reflected the society of the 18th century. It was the time before the French Revolution, an era of nobility and courtly culture. In the salons, conversation, music, games, and parties were cultivated. Art was an expression of this attitude to life, not struggle, not power, but grace and pleasure. But this lightness was not without shadow. Critics accused the Rococo of superficiality, of losing itself in the decorative. In a way, he was the last flower of the old nobility before new currents such as classicism and enlightenment entered the scene with the Revolution. Nevertheless, Rococo remains a unique chapter in art history. He shows that art does not always have to be monumental, but can also unfold its power in the delicate, playful, and elegant. His pastel colors, his shell ornaments, his scenes of lightness and love still have their charm today. Rococo is the art of smiling, light, playful, elegant, a touch of luxury and transience at the same time. It is the sensual epilogue of the Baroque before the austerity of the new era dawned. Chapter 13. Classicism and Romanticism, Reason and Feeling. The late 18th century marked the beginning of a period of upheaval. The playful elegance of the Rococo was followed by Classicism, which rediscovered the clarity and austerity of antiquity. At the same time, Romanticism developed, which directed the gaze into the interior, into the feeling, and into the mysterious. These two currents were partly opposed to each other, partly they complemented each other, and shaped the art of an epoch that was determined by the Enlightenment, Revolution, and a new self-image. Classicism emerged as a deliberate departure from the abundance of Rococo. Inspired by the excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum, antiquity was rediscovered. Artists, architects, and scholars saw in her the model of a pure, clear, and rational art. In a time when the Enlightenment focused on reason and order, the recourse to antiquity was an expression of a new ideal. The architecture of Classicism is characterized by symmetry, clarity, and measure. Columns, temple fronts, and domes were taken up again, but in a strict, reduced form. In France, the Madeleine Church in Paris was built like an ancient temple. In Germany, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin was built as a triumphal arch based on the Roman model. In America, too, classicist forms were used. The Capitol in Washington or the White House show how classicism became a symbol of political ideals. In painting, Jacques-Louis David embodied the spirit of classicism. His works such as The Oath of the Horatii or The Death of Marat combined strict composition with a political message. Here, art became an instrument of revolution, an expression of virtue, sacrifice, and republican ideals. His students, such as Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, also continued this line by combining immaculate, clear shapes with cool elegance. But while classicism emphasized reason and order, a counter-movement was steering at the same time: Romanticism. She turned against the sobriety of reason and searched for feeling, fantasy, and the infinite. Man was not seen as a rational being, but as a sentient, dreaming individual, striving for freedom. Romantic painting impressively shows this longing. Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes that not only show nature, but are landscapes of the soul. A lonely wanderer looks out over a sea of fog.
Monks stand under barren frieze, images full of melancholy that make the sublime, the infinite, and the mysterious palpable. In France, Eugène Delacroix painted with powerful colors and passionate drama. His famous painting, Freedom Leads the People, shows not only a political event, but the ideal of freedom in personified form. Théodore Géricault, with his Raft of the Medusa, also embodied the romantic drama. Desperate people on a shipwreck, an image of suffering and hope at the same time. The architecture of the Romantic period took up historical styles, especially the Gothic. Cathedrals were considered an expression of a deeper, mysterious past. In England, the so-called Neo-Gothic style emerged, which rebuilt castles, churches, and universities in medieval forms. At first glance, classicism and romanticism are opposites: reason against feeling, clarity against longing, antiquity against the Middle Ages. But both are children of the same time. Both reflect the search for orientation in an era full of upheavals, from the French Revolution to the Napoleonic Wars to the national movement in the 19th century. The art of this period shows us how diverse the ways are to express the human. In classicism, we find order, moderation, and the hope of reason. In romanticism, we discover the feeling, the mysterious, and the longing for freedom. Together, they form an epoch that has shaped modern art and our image of man to this day.
Chapter 14. Realism and Impressionism. Seeing the world with new eyes. In the middle of the 19th century, a new phase began in art. The Industrial Revolution, the social upheavals, and the changes in everyday life posed new questions for the artists. While classicism strove for moderation and reason, and romanticism emphasized feeling and longing, artists now turned to real life. This is how realism was born, an art that wanted to show the world as it was, without idealization, without mythological transfiguration. Shortly thereafter, Impressionism appeared on the scene, which grasped reality anew not through themes, but through the moment, through light and color. Realism was a deliberate departure from idealizing art. Artists such as Gustave Courbet painted peasants, workers, and scenes of everyday life with the same dignity previously reserved for kings and heroes. His painting, The Burial of Ornans, shows a simple funeral in a French provincial town, monumental in format and seriousness, but without any transfiguration. Realism wanted to show the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. In Germany, Adolf von Menzel advocated similar approaches. His pictures of workers in iron mills or scenes from everyday life in Prussia are precise observations of a changing world. Here, art became a mirror of society, a kind of chronicle of the industrial era. But while realism depicted the world in a clear, sober form, the Impressionists discovered a new way of perceiving reality. They did not ask, "What is the world?" but "How does it appear to us at the moment?" Impressionism was a revolution in seeing. The Impressionists painted in the open air, in the streets, gardens, and cafes of modern cities. They dispensed with clear contours and preferred short, fleeting brushstrokes that captured the impression of the moment. Claude Monet is considered one of the founders of this direction. His painting, Impression Sunrise, gave the movement its name. In his water lily paintings, the world dissolves almost completely into light and color. Pierre-Auguste Renoir also loved light, especially playing on human skin. His scenes of dance, music, and society are full of joy, warmth, and tenderness. Edgar Degas, on the other hand, turned to modern life. Ballet dancers, horse races, women at the toilet. He combined realistic observation with impressionistic technique. Another great impressionist was Edouard Manet, who built a bridge between realism and impressionism. His paintings such as Breakfast on the Green or Olympia caused scandals because they depicted traditional themes, nudity, society, in a modern, unembellished form. The special thing about Impressionism was the observation of light.
The painters studied how colors change in the sunlight, how shadows do not appear gray but colorful, how the moment is fleeting. They dispensed with strict composition in order to capture the liveliness of the moment. The impact of Impressionism was enormous. Initially ridiculed by the Academy and the public, it soon established itself as one of the most important movements in art history. He opened the way to modernity by showing that art no longer has to be the image of an object of reality, but can express the subjective impression, the perception of the moment. Realism and Impressionism are thus two sides of the same time. Both wanted to capture reality, realism sober and direct, Impressionism fleeting and colorful. Both broke with old traditions and opened up new paths. They show us that art not only represents ideals or desires, but also the world we live in, as it is and as it appears to us.
Chapter 15. Symbolism and Art Nouveau. Art between dream and ornament. Towards the end of the 19th century, many artists were looking for new forms of expression that went beyond the sober depiction of realism and the fleeting impressions of Impressionism. The world was in a state of upheaval. Industrialization, science, psychology, and philosophy questioned the self-image of humans. In this atmosphere, two movements arose that sought answers in very different ways: Symbolism and Art Nouveau. Symbolism was directed against the purely external representation of reality. Instead, he searched for the inside, for dreams, myths, and the world of the unconscious. Symbols became the key to making the invisible visible. Symbolism was strongly inspired by literature, philosophy, and psychology, and did not want to depict external nature, but the soul, the mystery, the longing. In painting, this was evident in artists such as Gustave Moreau in France, who painted mythological and biblical scenes full of mysterious atmosphere. Odilon Redon also created dreamlike, often enigmatic images, flowers that were also symbols of the soul, or fantasy figures that seemed to come from an inner world. In Northern Europe, Edward Munch embodied the symbolist direction. His famous painting, The Scream, does not show a realistic scene, but an inner feeling, fear, despair, existential threat. It is a symbol of the inner conflict of modern man, an image that has an effect far beyond time. Symbolism was thus a movement that combined art with philosophy and the psyche. It opened the way to modernism, in which art no longer merely showed the visible world, but expressed inner truths. At the same time, Art Nouveau, also known internationally as Art Nouveau, developed. While symbolism looked into the depths of the interior, Art Nouveau turned to the surface. Not in superficiality, however, but in the design of form and ornament. Art Nouveau emerged around 1900 and was a reaction to industrialization. In a world shaped by machines and mass production, artists were looking for a new unity of art and life. Everything should be beautifully designed, from architecture to furniture to everyday objects. Art should not only exist in museums, but become part of daily life. Typical of Art Nouveau are curved lines, floral ornaments, and organic shapes. Plants, flowers, and female figures became leitmotifs that appeared in furniture, jewelry, posters, and architecture. The line itself became an ornament, elegantly curved like a growing plant. Famous representatives of Art Nouveau are Gustav Klimt in Vienna, whose paintings such as The Kiss combined gold, ornament, and sensuality. Hector Guimard worked in Paris, creating the famous entrances of the Paris Metro with curved lines. In Barcelona, Antoni Gaudí shaped architecture with his imaginative organic buildings such as the Sagrada Familia. Art Nouveau also found a great echo in Germany, for example in the work of Henry van de Velde or in the designs of the Darmstadt artists' colony. Furniture, houses, wallpaper, crockery, everything was artistically designed in the hopes of enhancing life with beauty. Art Nouveau was therefore more than an art style, it was a philosophy of life. Art should not stand in isolation, but shape everyday life. In this way, Art Nouveau anticipated much of what was later systematically realized in the Bauhaus, the unity of art, craftsmanship, and design.
Together, symbolism and Art Nouveau embody the tensions of their time. Symbolism looked inwards, into the soul, into the dreamlike and mythical. Art Nouveau looked outwards, into the world of shapes, ornaments, and lifestyle. But both were united by the pursuit of an art that is more than representation, an expression of longing, of wholeness, of a different, more beautiful reality.
Chapter 16, Expressionism and the Avant-Garde, Breaks with Traditions. With the beginning of the 20th century, the development of art accelerated dramatically. The world was undergoing profound change: industrialization, urbanization, new scientific findings, and, last but not least, the experiences of the First World War shook the previous worldview. The artists reacted to this by deliberately breaking old traditions and developing radically new forms of expression. Harmony and beauty were replaced by expression, subjectivity, and experimentation. Expressionism was one of the most important currents of this time. His goal was not to depict the outer reality, but the inner, the emotional, the existential. Forms were distorted, colors garish and unnatural, compositions angular and agitated. The human being was no longer idealized, but shown in his inner turmoil, fear, and passion. In Germany, two important groups of artists were formed: Die Brücke in Dresden, with painters such as Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Emil Nolde, and Erich Heckel, and Der Blaue Reiter in Munich, with artists such as Wassily Kandinsky, Franz Marc, and August Macke. While Die Brücke sought a raw, immediate expressiveness with angular shapes and intense colors, Der Blaue Reiter was more oriented towards the symbolism and spirituality of color. Franz Marc painted animals as symbols of a pure, better world, while Kandinsky took the path to abstraction and found spiritual expression in the color itself. Expressionism was also strongly associated with literature, music, and theater. Poets such as Georg Trakl or Franz Werfel, composers such as Arnold Schoenberg, were also looking for new forms of expression that reflected inner tensions and the break with the old world. At the same time, other avant-gardes emerged that broke radically new ground. Futurism in Italy glorified speed, technology, and the dynamism of the modern world. Painters such as Umberto Boccioni and Giacomo Balla painted speeding cars, machines, and movements in dissolved forms, a reflection of a time marked by progress and destruction at the same time. Cubism, developed by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque in Paris, revolutionized the representation of things. Instead of showing the world from one angle, they broke down the shapes into geometric elements and reassembled them. The world became fragmented, multidimensional, abstract. A picture like Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon marked the break with centuries of naturalistic representation. Dadaism also emerged during this time, initially in Zurich during the First World War. It was a radical rejection of all traditional art. Dada was protest, mockery, and provocation. Artists such as Hugo Ball, Tristan Tzara, or Marcel Duchamp asked the question, what is art anyway? Duchamp's famous fountain, a simple urinal that he declared to be a work of art, called into question the entire understanding of art. Another movement was Surrealism, which emerged in the 1920s under the influence of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. Artists such as Salvador Dalí, Max Ernst, and René Magritte wanted to make the world of dreams, the unconscious, the irrational visible. Melting clocks, floating figures, enigmatic spaces, Surrealism opened up a pictorial world that lay beyond reason and yet was of deep meaning. All these currents had one thing in common: the will to break with tradition. Art should no longer just depict, but recreate, shock, and ask questions. Shapes, colors, materials, everything was questioned and tried out anew. The avant-gardes of the early 20th century thus prepared the ground for all modern art. They asked the basic question: does art have to depict reality, or can it completely detach itself from it? Does it have to be beautiful, or can it disturb? Does it have to be an object, or can it be an idea?
The answers were manifold, and they still shape art today. Expressionism with its emotional force, Cubism with its fragmentation of reality, Surrealism with its dream worlds, all these are currents that have changed the view of the world forever.
Chapter 17. Art in the Age of World Wars, Propaganda, Trauma, and New Beginnings. The 20th century was marked by two world wars that not only shook political and social orders, but also changed art permanently. Artists were faced with the challenge of reacting to violence, destruction, and ideological propaganda. Some were placed in the service of the powers. Others resisted and sought new forms of expression to make the trauma of the time visible. During the First World War, art experienced a deep crisis. Many avant-gardes that had previously been supported by a belief in progress, such as futurism, lost their innocence in the face of horror. Instead of euphoria about technology and dynamics, the horror of machine wars now dominated. The Dadaism that emerged in Zurich was a direct response to this. It mocked every logic and every form that had made possible a world that was drowning in blood and trenches. Dada was outcry and protest, anarchy and refusal at the same time. Expressionism also showed the emotional upheaval. Otto Dix and George Grosz painted the destruction, the injured, the misery of the returnees. Her works are testimonies to a time in which trust in culture and progress was shattered. Dix's pictures of war-mutilated people are merciless indictments of the war and the society that made it possible. With the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 1930s, art increasingly became propaganda. In Germany, the Nazi regime tried to suppress modernity and establish an Aryan art, heroic bodies, peasant idols, glorification of the Führer. Modern works were defamed as degenerate. Many artists had to flee or fell silent. In the Soviet Union, socialist realism prevailed. Art had to glorify the ideals of communism. Workers, peasants, and party leaders were staged as heroes. At the same time, works were created in exile and in inner emigration that resisted. Picasso created one of the most haunting paintings of the century in 1937 with Guernica, a monumental indictment of the air raid on the Basque city, a symbol of the horror of war in general. The picture is fragmented, chaotic, full of pain, and at the same time a universal memorial against violence. The Second World War left even deeper traces. Art was instrumentalized in many ways. Posters, films, monuments served to mobilize. But after 1945, art was faced with an existential question. How could images still be created after Auschwitz and Hiroshima? The philosopher Theodor Adorno famously formulated the question of whether poems were still possible after Auschwitz. Art reacted with ruptures, silence, and radical new paths. In Germany, the art of rubble was created. Sculptures and paintings that depicted the destroyed country and the mental devastation. Artists such as Anselm Kiefer later took up the guilt and memory of the Nazi era and created works that linked history and trauma. Internationally, the trauma of the war led to a turn to abstraction. The horrors no longer seemed to be depicted in traditional images. Instead, new forms of expression emerged, such as abstract expressionism in the USA, with artists such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. Her large-format paintings were not representations in the classical sense, but an expression of energy, emotion, and transcendence. Art in the age of the world wars is characterized by contrasts, propaganda and instrumentalization on the one hand, protest, mourning, and new beginnings on the other. It shows how art does not exist independently of history, but is deeply woven into it. It reflects the drama of the 20th century, the seduction of ideologies, the suffering of violence and destruction, but also the ability to create something new out of rubble and trauma.
The art of this epoch is not beautiful in the classical sense, but it is necessary as a testimony, as an accusation, as an attempt to give form to the unspeakable.
Chapter 18, Modernism after 1945, Abstraction, Pop Art, and New Media. After the end of the Second World War, a new era of art began. The world was divided politically, economically in the process of reconstruction, and culturally in the search for orientation. During this time, movements emerged that fundamentally changed art. Radical abstraction, pop art, conceptual art, and finally the exploration of new media. Abstract expressionism was particularly formative in the USA. Artists such as Jackson Pollock developed so-called action painting. Paint was no longer applied in traditional forms, but dripped, poured, or hurled onto the canvas. The painting process itself became a work of art. Pollock's huge canvases are chaotic and dynamic, an expression of pure energy. Mark Rothko took a different approach. His color-filled paintings consist of large, luminous rectangles that were intended to evoke silence, depth, and transcendence in the viewer. This art was no longer representation, but experience. At the same time, informal and abstract art without a predetermined form emerged in Europe. Artists such as Wohls and Hans Hartung experimented with spontaneous gestures, structures, and materials. Here, too, the focus was on expression, not image. In the 1950s and 1960s, artists reacted to the increasing consumer society and the ubiquity of mass media. This developed into pop art, which took over the everyday world into art. Andy Warhol printed soup cans, Coke bottles, and portraits of Marilyn Monroe in bright colors. He showed that the boundary between art and consumption, between high culture and mass culture, could become blurred. Roy Lichtenstein translated the visual language of the comics into monumental paintings, with dots, speech bubbles, and exaggerated drama. Pop art was ironic and provocative at the same time. It made visible that the modern world was shaped by advertising, media images, and consumption. At the same time, she asked the question, if everything can be art, what distinguishes the work of art from the everyday object? This question led to conceptual art in the 1960s and 1970s. Artists such as Joseph Kosuth explained that the idea was more important than the object. A sentence on the wall could be just as much a work of art as a picture. Marcel Duchamp's provocative legacy was continued. The focus was no longer on the craftsmanship, but on the concept. Performance art also gained importance. Artists like Marina Abramović turned their own bodies into a medium. Pain, endurance, encounter with the audience, all this became part of the art. Art became an event, not an object. At the same time, new currents developed, such as minimal art, which worked with radical reduction. Artists such as Donald Judd or Dan Flavin used simple geometric shapes or neon tubes to design spaces. Less was more here. The concentration was on material, space, and perception. With the development of technology, new media also entered the arts. Photography and film had been part of artistic practice for some time, but now video art also became important. Nam-June Paik experimented with televisions, monitors, and electronic images long before digital media became commonplace. Art after 1945 is characterized by plurality. There is no longer one style, one direction, but a variety of approaches: abstraction, pop, concept, minimal, performance, media art. This diversity reflects the open, often contradictory world of the post-war period. At the same time, it shows that art does not stand still. It reacts to society, politics, technology, and always opens up new paths. Whether abstract color fields, ironic soup cans, or body actions, art after 1945 broadened horizons and questioned the definition of art itself. Chapter 19, Postmodernism and Contemporary Art, Diversity Without Borders. The 1980s marked the beginning of an era in art that is often referred to as postmodernism. After the radical ruptures and experiments of modernism, a time came when everything seemed possible. Artists took up styles of the past, combined them in new ways, played with irony and quotations. There was no longer a uniform style, but a diversity that still characterizes contemporary art today. A central feature of postmodernism is irony. Artists borrowed from antiquity, the Renaissance, the Baroque, or pop art, but not in the sense of a return, but as a conscious play with history. Painting, sculpture, architecture, and design became a field in which quotations, ruptures, and contradictions were allowed. This was particularly evident in architecture. While modernism relied on strict functionality and minimalism, postmodernism experimented with colors, shapes, and historical echoes. Buildings by architects such as Michael Graves or Philip Johnson combined classic columns with modern materials, serious and playful at the same time. In painting, the expressive picture experienced a renaissance. Artists such as Jean-Michel Basquiat combined graffiti, symbols, and raw painting to create an explosive art that reflected the urban culture of the 1980s. Keith Haring brought street art to galleries and museums with his colorful, comic-like figures. The sculpture and installation of postmodernism often took up everyday objects, placed them in new contexts, and played with meanings. Jeff Koons, for example, created huge sculptures of inflatable animals made of stainless steel, kitschy and monumental at the same time. In doing so, he posed questions about taste, consumption, and the art market. Contemporary art after the turn of the millennium is characterized by an even greater diversity. There are no longer any clear boundaries between painting, sculpture, photography, installation, performance, and media art. Anything can be art, and often it is precisely the crossing of boundaries that fascinates. An important field is the global perspective. While art history has long been Eurocentric, today artists from Africa, Asia, and Latin America are coming to the fore. Biennial international exhibitions show that art is a worldwide network that connects different cultures, topics, and forms of expression. Digitization is also shaping contemporary art. Video, internet, and virtual reality are new media that artists are using. Digital art, interactive installations, and AI-generated works pose the question of what creativity means in the digital age. Even NFTs, non-fungible tokens, have changed the art world by making digital works tradable and collectible. Another central issue is politics. Contemporary art responds to climate change, globalization, migration, gender issues, and social inequality. Artists such as Ai Weiwei use their works as political statements that denounce grievances and initiate debates. Art is not only aesthetic, but also a means of social debate. The diversity of contemporary art is both its strength and its challenge. There is no binding style, no common program. Some long for orientation, others celebrate openness. What is certain, however, is that art has never been so pluralistic, so global, and so closely linked to the issues of the world as it is today. Postmodernism and the present show us that art is not a closed chapter, but an open field that is constantly reinventing itself. It is a mirror of the times, a field of experimentation for ideas, and an expression of a humanity that is constantly reshaping itself. Chapter 20. Outlook: The Future of Art. When we look back at the history of art, we see a constant interplay of tradition and innovation, of continuity and rupture. Each epoch has tried in its own way to provide answers to the questions of its time. What does beauty mean? What is the human being? What role does art play in society? Now, in the 21st century, we are once again at a point where art is redefining itself. A central aspect of the present is digitalization. More and more artists are using digital media to implement their ideas. Virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, all these technologies open up possibilities that were unthinkable just a few decades ago. Works of art today can be interactive, changing depending on how the viewer moves or interacts with them. Entire virtual worlds are created that are not bound to canvas or stone. At the same time, the art economy is changing production.
With the development of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, it has become possible to uniquely label and trade digital works. This development raises questions. Is a digital image that can be copied infinitely still an original? What does ownership mean in the digital space? The answers to these questions have not yet been found, but they will shape the art world. The topics of the future are also foreseeable. Climate change, for example, will influence not only politics and society, but also art. Many artists are already dealing with ecological issues, sustainability, and the relationship between humans and nature. Art can be a medium here that not only sensitizes, but also opens up new perspectives. Another major field is global networking. Art has always been international, but today the exchange is more immediate than ever before. Artists from all continents enter into dialogue, and their works are visible worldwide via social media. This networking leads to even greater diversity, but also to new questions. How can local traditions be preserved when everything circulates globally? How can voices from previously marginalized regions be heard? The role of the viewer is also changing. In the past, art was something you looked at, a picture, a sculpture, a building. Today, art is becoming increasingly interactive. You can enter it, influence it, help shape it. The boundary between artist and audience is blurred. Art becomes a shared experience that no longer depends solely on the genius of the individual. Despite all the changes, one thing remains constant: the function of art as a mirror and expression of humanity. Art was and is more than decoration. It is memory and vision, criticism and celebration, experiment and expression. It preserves the past and opens up the future. It connects people across times and spaces.